I'm fascinated by the power of storytelling. Stories are all around us. They're the way that we understand the world and our place in it. Throughout the generations, stories have been told in order to pass on the values and the ways of the tribe. And now more than ever, we need our stories to understand who we are and what we're doing right now, how we respond to what's going on in the world. I've come to see that we are all storytellers. We're constantly telling the stories of our lives. We tell stories of how we met our partners, where we had dinner last night, what happened on the way to work this morning. We experience something and then we tell the story. So in fact, the story creates our reality. It's really interesting because it's completely subjective. We choose everything about the story. We choose who's going to be in it. We choose what stories to tell and how to tell them. And yet then we call it reality and we pretend as if it suddenly landed upon us and we had nothing to do with it. And yet we have created that reality by the story that we choose to tell. Now oftentimes we tell powerful stories, we tell great stories, and these are the stories that drive us to achieve, to move forward with our lives, to create good relationships. These are the stories that really make us successful. But at the same time, there are so many stories that do us a great disservice. Oftentimes we're as committed to the stories that keep us small and keep us limited and get us stuck as we are to the great stories. We don't even notice them sometimes. I'm sure you're aware of that person who comes to dinner. We've all got someone like this. The person who comes to dinner who tells the same old story. We know every word of it. I started wondering, why do we get stuck in our stories? What do they serve? And we all have these negative stories. We all have these stories that we get stuck in, that we repeat, the stories of what we can't do, the stories of what should have happened, the stories of what we might have done. And these stories we repeat again and again and again until they become our reality. There's a great story about Hoja Nasruddin. He was known as the wise fool. One day Hoja was walking down the street. Suddenly he screamed and jumped to the side. And people came to him and said, "Hoja, what's wrong?" He said, "There used to be a great hole in the ground right here. It was terrible. People would fall in, people hurt themselves. I saw a man once break his leg and I myself fell in this hole many times." They said, "But Hoja, the hole was filled many, many months ago." He said, "Yes, the hole is gone, but the fear remains." And the stories that we tell about the fear, they remain too. In fact, we constantly tell these negative stories. And you know there are other stories to tell. So here's the thing. In any given experience, the way we tell it, well, about 95% of it is our interpretation. Our interpretation based on our background, on our experience, on our education, on our worldview. Only about 5% is actually factually correct. So 95% is what we have created. It's our story. Now there is another story. There's a story of resilience and a story of overcoming adversity. You've heard them. We all hear them, of these people who have become amazing things. But you have a story like that too. And you have a choice. We all have a choice in how we tell our stories. We can tell them stuck in fear and stuck in difficulty, as the victim, as the person who's so incredibly powerless. Or we can step up and take responsibility and create much more empowering stories. Because as you know, the story becomes the reality. The more you can create your vision of how you take responsibility with your life and how you want to create the things you want to create, the more that will actually come true. It's not about pretending that the past didn't happen. It's not about pretending that we didn't have these very challenging life events. That stuff always happens. Just when we think life is going smoothly, something happens that creates a new challenge, whether it's an illness or a death or some kind of financial difficulty. And we certainly know that this has happened in the last few years worldwide. We've been presented with more challenges than ever before. And yet, in the face of these challenges, there's still enormous possibility and enormous opportunity. And it's so much about the story we tell. Whether we get stuck in those challenges or whether we can use them as the way to fuel the possibility that can be created as a result. And it's all about that intention and about seeing the possibility and making the vision of what could be, taking responsibility for that too. But we have a choice. And there are better stories to tell. And you know those stories. These are stories of resilience, stories of overcoming great adversity, stories where people have succeeded in the face of enormous challenge. But it's not just them, it's not just that person out there who's managed, against all odds to have this great success. You have stories like this too. We all do. So we can retell our painful, fearful stories and make them empowering. And when I say that, I don't mean somehow ignoring the challenge, ignoring the difficulty, pretending that it never happened, but allowing the story emerge out of the challenge to show what you've learned and who you've become. Think about it. Any moment that you've had that was what I call a pivotal moment, that time where something shifted for you, something changed, where you had an awareness that you'd never had before. It may have been a negative situation, it may have been a positive situation, but in that moment everything changed and everything was different. Who were you in that moment? What did you discover? What did you understand about yourself? How were you resilient? How were you strong? How did you feel the empowerment and the ability to create something new? Because these stories, these powerful stories, are about reinvention. They're about seeing possibility, and you can do that. We all do it all the time. That's how we survive. So go back to your pivotal moment and allow the story emerge from there and see the true nature of that story, because that's the true nature of you. That's who you are in your most empowering and in your most able. So what story are you going to choose to tell? Is it a story of fear, or is it the story of possibility? There was once a king who was fascinated by the idea of peace. He sent out a declaration to the whole kingdom that anybody who could paint the most perfect picture of peace would be greatly rewarded. And many people tried. People came from far and near. They brought these beautiful paintings in all different materials, and they presented them to the palace. The king spent many days in deliberation until finally he chose 2 paintings, and he knew that he needed to make that final choice to find the perfect picture of peace. The first painting, it was of a perfect lake, and the lake was a mirror of the mountains that towered around it. These mountains were lush and green, and above these beautiful mountains was a perfect blue sky with just 1 or 2 fluffy white clouds floating through it. Everybody who looked at that painting felt that it was indeed the perfect picture of peace. And then there was the second picture. The second picture also had mountains, but these mountains were rugged and bare, and above them there was an angry sky full of dark grey clouds and lightning and rain pouring down. In the middle of the mountains there was a foaming, angry waterfall, and people who looked at it, well, it didn't look like a peaceful picture at all. But when the king looked closely, he saw that behind the waterfall there was a rock, and on the rock there was a bush, and sitting in the bush was a mother bird who sat on her nest, and she was the perfect picture of peace. Well, finally the king chose the second picture, because he said, peace is not when everything is calm and going smoothly and everything in the surroundings are perfect. Peace is when there's great commotion and great anger, a great storm, and yet in the midst of all that, there is peace in your heart. That's the true nature of peace. And so in the midst of this angry storm, in this truly challenging, perhaps the most challenging of times, what story do you choose to tell?